So teleological arguments. They're called that because the ancient Greek word telos means something like purpose or goal. And teleological arguments point to things in nature that appear to have a purpose or a telos, that appear to have examples of design, and argue that, well, if they're designed, there must be a designer, i.e. God. So, for example, how do you explain how all the parts of an eye come together to achieve the purpose or telos of vision? Or how the structure of a bird's wings is perfectly suited to enable it to fly? Or how the gills in this gormless fish are perfectly designed to extract oxygen from the water? You think that just happened by chance? Well, how then do you explain this?
Behold the atheist's nightmare. Now, if you study a well-made banana, you'll find the maker of the banana, Almighty God, has made it with a non-slip surface. It's chewy, easy to digest, and it's even curved toward the face to make the whole process so much easier.
You're probably thinking evolution, aren't you? Well, alright, but I've got examples of teleological arguments that came after Darwin and that point to examples of order and purpose in nature beyond what can be seen in stuff that evolves. So yeah, that's the topic of today's video. We're going to be looking at a bunch of teleological arguments and objections to see whether we can prove examples of design in nature and therefore a designer of nature, i.e. God. So teleological arguments go back a long way. Like I said, this word telos is an ancient Greek word. Aristotle talked about telos and final causes, meaning like a purpose or, well, Aristotle's Metaphysics is a topic for another day. But Aristotle was a big influence on Thomas Aquinas, who I'm going to say was the first person to come up with a teleological argument in the sense we're going to be talking about today. So Aquinas, I'm just going to read you what he says. So Aquinas says, "We see that things which lack intelligence, such as natural bodies, act for an end, and this is evident from their acting always or nearly always in the same way so as to obtain the best result. Hence it is plain that not fortuitously, but designedly, do they achieve their end. Now whatever lacks intelligence cannot move towards an end, unless it be directed by some being endowed with knowledge and intelligence, as the arrow is shot to its mark by the archer. Therefore, some intelligent being exists, by whom all natural things are directed to their end, and this being we call God." Aquinas' point is that things in nature, even without consciousness, consistently act towards ends or goals. So the plant grows towards the light so it can photosynthesize, even if it's not aware of consciously doing so. Or maybe plants do have consciousness. Or maybe a better example would be the heart, which pumps blood in order to achieve the goal of circulating oxygen in the body, even though the heart doesn't have a conscious awareness or intelligence of doing so. And for Aquinas, these patterns can't be explained by luck. There has to be an intelligence that's guiding the plant and the heart and all these things towards their goals. There has to be an intelligence guiding these things to act in these purposeful ways, like how an arrow reaches its target only when it's guided by an archer. The problem, though, is that Aquinas' argument here assumes a kind of Aristotelian metaphysics, this idea of final causes, where everything has a purpose or an end which it naturally tends towards. And this idea of final causes is kind of considered old-fashioned since at least Newton and the scientific scientific revolution. Because, let me give an example, right? So with the example of the plant, rather than explaining the plant's growth towards the sun as directed by some kind of inherent purpose or intention, a modern scientific explanation would explain the plant's growth through natural, mechanistic, impersonal processes. I don't know what the exact explanation would be, but it would talk about energy from the sunlight, photosynthesis, nutrients in water and the soil, and then genetic instructions in the DNA guiding the plant's growth. So growth would happen as a result of these chemical and biological processes, which are governed by physical and chemical laws, rather than some deliberate purpose or intention in the plant. The point is, we've replaced these kind of teleological, purposeful, intentional explanations with these impersonal scientific laws like gravity, electromagnetism, you know what I'm saying, basically impersonal, scientific, natural processes rather than personal, goal-orientated, kind of intentional. Hopefully you know what I'm saying. So yeah, that's Aquinas' fifth way, and while these appeals to teleological, more kind of intentional, personal explanations have kind of been replaced by appeals to impersonal scientific explanations, we're kind of going to come back to this distinction between scientific and personal explanations later in the video. But for now, let's move on to Hume's teleological argument. I say Hume's teleological argument, but Hume's book, Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, whatever it's called, is a dialogue between various characters, one of which is called Cleanthes, and Cleanthes is the one who proposes the teleological argument in this dialogue. So Cleanthes says, "Look round the world, contemplate the whole and every part of it. You'll find it to be nothing but one great machine, subdivided into an infinite number of lesser machines, which again admit of subdivisions to a degree beyond which human senses and faculties can trace and explain. All these various machines, and even their most minute parts, are adjusted to each other with an accuracy which ravishes into admiration all men who have ever contemplated them. The curious adapting of means to ends throughout all nature resembles exactly, though it much exceeds, the productions of human contrivance, of human design, thought, wisdom and intelligence. Since therefore the effects resemble each other, we are led to infer by all the rules of analogy that the causes also resemble, and that the author of nature is somewhat similar to the mind of man, though possessed of much larger faculties proportioned to the grandeur of the work which he has executed. By this argument a posteriori, and by this argument alone, do we prove at once the existence of God, and his similarity to human mind and intelligence." So Hume's argument here is an argument from analogy, that because A and B are the same in one respect, they're probably going to be similar in another respect. So for example, if your friend has the same art and music tastes that you do, then it's reasonable to infer that they're probably going to have similar movie tastes to you as well. Now, these arguments from analogy are never going to be logically watertight. You know, it's obviously possible that your friend could like the same art and music as you, but have a completely different taste in movies. But nevertheless, if two things are similar in certain ways, it's good inductive evidence that they're probably going to be similar in other ways as well. And the strength of an argument from analogy depends on how similar the two things being compared are. The more similarities between these two things, the more reasonable it is to conclude that these two things can be similar in another way, if that makes sense. So this is what Hume/Cleanthes is saying here, that the universe is like a machine in the sense that the universe is orderly, complex and full of parts that serve particular functions. For example, the various parts of the eye are organised for the purpose of sight, or the orbit of the Earth around the Sun is such that it's perfectly suited to sustaining life. So with these examples, and everywhere we look all over the universe, there's a fitting of means to ends, to use Hume's vocabulary. And so The universe is like a machine in this respect. If you look at a car or a watch, for example, there's also a fitting of means to ends there. For example, the parts of a watch are fit together to achieve the end of telling the time. And so they're similar in this way. And so we can use an argument from analogy to say that, well, because they're similar in this way, they might be similar in another way, which is we know that man-made items like the watch and the car have a designer. And so given that we know this about man-made items, and that man-made items are similar to the universe in the sense there's a fitting of means to end, then by analogy, we can argue that the universe, like man-made stuff, also has a designer. And says Cleanthes, given the scope of this design, given the grandeur of the universe compared to man-made designs like a car and a watch, this designer must be incredibly intelligent and incredibly powerful. And so an incredibly intelligent and powerful, you might say omniscient and omnipotent designer exists, and so God exists. So like I said, Hume's teleological argument is part of a wider dialogue which includes responses to this teleological argument from analogy. So through the character Philo, Hume raises a bunch of objections to Cleanthes' teleological argument. So as mentioned, arguments from analogy are only as strong as the similarities between the two things being compared. So a lion is a fluffy animal like a cat, and cats make good pets, but it doesn't follow from this that a lion would also make a good pet. So just because lions and cats are similar in some ways, it doesn't follow that they're similar in all ways. And the same thing goes for similarities between man-made machines and the universe. So yeah, while there's a fitting of means to ends in the case of man-made machines and the universe, there's also a bunch of differences. So one such difference that Philo points out is that we have experience of seeing somebody design and make these man-made objects such as watches and cars, but we don't have the same experience in the case of nature's designs. So nobody's ever seen somebody consciously design and build an eye, for example. Instead, all we do experience are natural processes like growth and reproduction. So Philo argues that, if anything, this points away from a conscious designer of nature to some natural process like nature itself, what Philo calls generation and vegetation. Secondly, Philo points out that Cleanthes cherry-picks specific examples of nature that are machine-like. So, like the eye or the wings of a bird, for example. It cherry-picks these specific examples of fitting of means to ends, and then generalises that to the universe as a whole. When you look at nature as a whole, it seems a lot less machine-like. You can't generalise from these cherry-picked examples of fitting of means to ends, and then say the whole universe resembles a machine. What's more, when you do look at the universe in its entirety, there's all sorts of parts that don't have this fitting of means to ends. There's huge empty areas of space and random rocks that don't serve any obvious purpose. And so this brings us to a related objection Hume makes, or Philo makes, of spatial disorder. So teleological arguments work by pointing to examples of order and purpose within nature. Again, the example of the many parts of the eye for vision. And then teleological arguments reason from this purpose and order to design, and therefore a designer. But if we look at the universe as a whole, such order and purpose seems to be the exception rather than the rule. So I mentioned how most of the universe is just empty space and random rocks that don't serve any obvious purpose. So why would a designer include such disorder? And so there's a bunch of stuff in the universe that doesn't seem very orderly, that doesn't seem very designed, and so this should count as evidence against a designer. In addition to these random rocks and stuff in the universe, there's also a bunch of examples here on Earth that you can point to as examples of disorder and bad design. So I don't want to dwell too much on this point because this is almost like getting into the problem of evil, which we're going to do in another video. But Philo points out several examples of flawed design or design that could be improved and spatial disorder, which again should count as evidence against a designer. So the first example Philo talks about is the use of pain to motivate humans and animals. So Philo says that even if there needed to be some mechanism to motivate animals to eat and so on, rather than motivating humans and animals by negative feelings of pain, such as hunger and thirst, a omnibenevolent designer, you might say, would prefer to create a world where humans and animals are only motivated by varying degrees of pleasure rather than pain. So with the example of thirst, rather than feeling it as like a negative pain, humans and animals could just be motivated by the pleasure of drinking. Likewise with food, rather than feeling the negative pain of hunger, a competent designer, says Philo, would make it so, make a world where the animals and humans were only motivated by the pleasant sensation of eating rather than the negative sensation of hunger. Secondly, Philo points out how the bodies of humans and animals could be easily improved. So a human being falls out of a high window or whatever and they break their bones. So Philo says, well, actually I don't know if Philo says this or if this is my example, but the point is, how hard would it be to have given humans and animals stronger bones? But we don't even need to go that far, says Philo. We don't need to demand that humans have the wings of the eagle, the swiftness of the stag, the force of the ox, the arms of the lion, and the scales of a crocodile. Why not make humans just less lazy? Philo says, almost all the moral as well as natural evils of human life arise from idleness, and were our species, by the original constitution of their frame, exempt from this vice or infirmity, the perfect cultivation of land, the improvement of arts and manufactures, the exact execution of every office and duty immediately follow, and men at once may fully reach that state of society, which is so imperfectly attained by the best regulated government. In other words, just this simple change to human nature would basically alleviate all human suffering. So Philo says, why didn't the designer make humans this way? Why didn't the designer make humanity less lazy? Thirdly, Philo points out that even things in nature that do seem well designed often go wrong. So the wind, for example, is useful in that it can power sailboats and windmills, but sometimes you get too much wind, which is hurricanes, which cause death and destruction. Or rain. Rain is good in that it enables plants to grow, you can get food, but sometimes you get too much rain, i.e. floods, and sometimes you get too little rain, i.e. droughts. So a competent designer, suggests Philo, would have made it so things like the wind and the rain would remain within these perfectly balanced limits rather than swaying between extremes like floods and droughts and so on. So these examples can all be used as evidence against design. The random rocks in the huge areas of empty space, the weakness of human and animal bodies, the use of pain to motivate rather than pleasure, the stuff that goes wrong like droughts and hurricanes and volcanoes and so on. These are all more consistent with a purposeless universe that is just formed by natural laws rather than a deliberate design choice that a designer included. But if you were to insist on a designer, you could use these examples of spatial disorder and design imperfections to argue that the designer isn't very good. And this brings us on to the next objection, which is the designer God? So if you remember from the concept of God video, we defined God as a singular monotheistic being who's maximally powerful, i.e. omnipotent, and perfectly good, i.e. omnibenevolent. Now, I don't think Hume explicitly defines God in this way, but in any case, Philo raises the objection about whether we can reason from the apparent design in the universe to the existence of a designer with these specific attributes. Firstly, Philo says we cannot conclude from the apparent design of the universe to a designer that's infinite and infinitely powerful, because Hume says the cause ought only to be proportioned to the effect, and the effect, so far as it falls under our cognizance, is not infinite. In other words, though very large, there's no evidence that the universe is infinitely large. And so if the universe is designed, there's no reason to suspect that this designer is infinitely powerful, i.e. omnipotent. This designer would be very powerful, but not necessarily omnipotent. Secondly, says Philo, even if we accept that the universe is designed, we can't conclude that this designer is perfectly good, i.e. omnibenevolent. So going back to the examples of spatial disorder and design imperfections from a few moments ago, we might say, well, why would a perfectly good designer include these hurricanes and droughts and so on? Why would the designer, if he's all perfectly good and all loving, why would he create animals such that they can feel pain, for example? This is straying a little bit into the problem of evil, by the way. So Philo admits that, yeah, it's possible for some reason that's just inexplicable to human minds that a perfectly good omnibenevolent designer would include pain and hurricanes and droughts and so on. Philo admits it's possible, but questions, how likely this is in reality. So based on all that we can observe of the universe, Philo says, a man who follows the hypothesis of a designer is able to perhaps assert or conjecture that the universe sometime arose from something like design, but beyond that position he cannot ascertain one single circumstance, and is left afterwards to fix every point of his theology by the utmost license of fancy and hypothesis. This world, for aught he knows, is very faulty and imperfect, compared to a superior standard, and was only the first rude essay of some infant deity, who afterwards abandoned it, ashamed of his lame performance. It is the work of some dependent, inferior deity, and is the object of derision to his superiors. It is the production of old age and dotage in some superannuated deity. And ever since his death has run on at adventures, from the first impulse and active force which it received from him. In other words, even if we accept that the universe is evidence of a designer, we can't really conclude anything about the properties of this designer. He could be some infant deity, as Hume says, who this was his kind of first draft, or it could have been some production by some, what do you say, like elderly deity who's since died, and the universe has just carried on without him. So all these possibilities are consistent with what we observe of the universe, and so we can't conclude from the apparent design of the universe, if it is designed, that this designer has the attributes of God as defined in the concept of God video. But Philo's not done just yet, so he continues to offer alternative hypotheses to explain the design of the universe. He says, a great number of men join in building a house or ship, in rearing a city, in framing a commonwealth, and so why may not several deities combine in contriving and framing a world? So, in other words, if you think about a car, for example, it's not like it's designed and made by one single person. And so what Philo is suggesting here is that, again, if the universe is designed, why couldn't it be the case that there's multiple designers? So with all these examples, Philo is questioning whether we can reason from the apparent design in nature to this omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent single being that religion typically understands God to be. And later on in the dialogue, Philo also considers another possible explanation of the apparent design of the universe, one that doesn't require a designer at all. And this is what Hume calls the Epicurean hypothesis, after the ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus, who basically invented concepts like the atom and multiple universes thousands of years before modern physics came up with these ideas. But if you've heard of it, the Epicurean hypothesis is basically the monkeys and typewriters thought experiment.
This is 1,000 monkeys working at 1,000 typewriters. Soon, they'll have written the greatest novel known to man. Let's see. It was the best of times. It was the blurst of times. You stupid monkey.
So if you haven't heard it, the monkeys and typewriters thought experiment says that if you have an infinite amount of monkeys at an infinite amount of typewriters, there's various different variations. So if you have an infinite number of monkeys at an infinite number of typewriters, eventually one of these monkeys will type the complete works of Shakespeare first time. Or if you have a single monkey at a typewriter, but an infinite amount of time, eventually this monkey will type the complete works of Shakespeare. And the point of these examples is not that the monkey would develop the intelligence to know what it's writing. The point is that it's more a point about the nature of infinity, that the monkey's just tapping keys at random, but eventually, given the nature of infinity, there's just so much time or so many attempts that eventually, just by pure chance, the monkey is going to hit the keys in the right order, just by blind luck, and type the complete works of Shakespeare. Now, Hume doesn't talk about monkeys and typewriters, but it's the same principle with the Epicurean hypothesis. So Hume says, instead of supposing matter infinite, as Epicurus did, let us suppose it finite. A finite number of particles is only susceptible of finite transpositions, and it must happen in an internal duration that every possible order or position must be tried an infinite number of times. This world, therefore, with all its events, even the most minute, has been produced and destroyed and will again be produced and destroyed without any bounds and limitations. No one who has a conception of the powers of infinite in comparison of finite will ever scruple this determination. So in the same way that a monkey hitting keys at random will, given an infinite amount of time, eventually type the complete works of Shakespeare, matter, given enough time, will eventually arrange itself into patterns that appear to be designed. And so, in both cases, this appearance of design is just luck. You know, the various parts of the eye coordinated to achieve vision is no more designed, there's no more intention there than the lucky monkey's great novel is evidence of design. Again, it's just random chance. Given an infinite amount of time, you get the appearance of design, but there's no intelligence behind it. For every great novel the monkey writes, there's going to be an infinite number of random strings of text that make no sense whatsoever. I have here in my hand William Paley's actual watch, which I bought for £1 million. Next up is William Paley's teleological argument. It was written in 1802, so after Hume but before Darwin. And if you ever heard of the watchmaker argument, this is where it comes from. So Paley says, in crossing a heath, suppose I pitched my foot against a stone and were asked how the stone came to be there. I might possibly answer that, for anything I knew to the contrary, it had lain there forever. Nor would it perhaps be very easy to show the absurdity of this answer. But suppose I had found a watch upon the ground, and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. I should hardly think of the answer which I had before given, that, for anything I knew, the watch might have always been there. Yet why should not this answer serve for the watch, as well as for the stone? In other words, if you just happened to find a watch in the field and you were wondering how it got there, you wouldn't be satisfied with the explanation that it just formed there by chance, like you might with a rock. So what's the difference between the watch and the rock? Well, Paley says the difference between the watch and the stone is that when we come to inspect the watch, we perceive what we could not discover in the stone, that its several parts are framed and put together for a purpose. So the various cogs and springs and coils of the watch are arranged together so that the watch can tell the time. If you were to take one of these cogs out, or if you were to arrange it differently, the watch wouldn't work. So the watch has clearly been arranged in this way for a purpose, to tell the time. For Paley, this is the defining property of design. Anything that has multiple parts arranged for a purpose must be designed, and so must have a designer. The watch has this property, but the rock doesn't. So Paley goes on to argue that this same property of having multiple parts arranged for a purpose can also be seen in nature. Every indication of contrivance, he says, every manifestation of design which existed in the watch exists in the works of nature. So he gives the example of an eye to illustrate this. The eye has many parts organised for the purpose of sight. So the cornea is like a window that lets in light and focuses it, and muscles around the pupil adjust its size and control how much light is let in. The lens changes shape so you can focus on things depending on whether they are nearby or far away, and so on. So all the parts of the eye work together to achieve the purpose of vision, in the same way that all the parts of the watch work together for the purpose of telling the time. So again, anything that has multiple parts arranged for a purpose must be designed, says Paley. This is the defining property of design. And nature exhibits this property all over the place. The eye is just one example. And so if there's design in nature, there must be a designer. So like I said, Paley wrote natural theology after Hume, and so Paley adapts his argument to respond to some of Hume's objections that we discussed previously. So firstly, I'm not sure if Paley does intend his argument to be interpreted this way, because this isn't something he says explicitly, but in response to Hume's criticisms of the analogy between the universe and man-made designs, well, you could say that Paley's argument is not an argument from analogy at all. It's instead a deductive argument. Something like anything that has multiple parts arranged for a purpose must be designed. The eye and aspects of nature have this property, and so the eye and aspects of nature must be designed. So Philo's first criticism, if you remember, was that there's all these differences between man-made items and the universe, and so the analogy is weak. But if Paley isn't making an analogy in the first place, then this criticism doesn't really work. As to Hume's point about spatial disorder, the vast areas of the universe that are just empty and filled with random rocks and don't seem to be designed, Paley says this doesn't matter, that it just takes a single instance of design to prove a designer. If there were but one watch in the world, he says, it would not be less certain that it had a maker. And so, even if most of the universe is disorderly, it just takes a single instance of design, whether it be an eye or a heart or whatever, to prove a designer. So, for Paley, the argument is cumulative. Every example of design we find is in itself sufficient evidence of a designer, and each subsequent example just makes the argument stronger. So Paley says, the eye proves design without the ear without the eye. The proof in each example is complete, for when the design of the part and the conduciveness of its structure to that design is shown, the mind may set itself at rest. No future consideration can detract anything from the force of the example. As for Hume's critiques of the kind of poor design, all these design imperfections like droughts and hurricanes and so on, Paley says this doesn't matter either, unsurprisingly. So Paley says even a broken watch is still evidence of design, and he probably has a point. So again, if you were walking through a field and you just happened to find a watch that was no longer working or was broken, you'd still take that as evidence of design. And so similarly, Paley says, even if there are parts of the universe that go wrong, like hurricanes or droughts or eyes that don't work perfectly or hearts that don't work perfectly, that doesn't disprove a designer, in the same way that a broken watch is still designed. A imperfect universe, imperfect design, still shows that there must be a designer. And in response to the Epicurean hypothesis, Hume's suggestion that given an infinite amount of time, matter will arrange itself into patterns that appear to be design, Paley says that this hypothesis doesn't seem very consistent with what we observe. So Paley rejects this explanation because he says if life really were just the result of random combinations of atoms rather than design, you'd get all kinds of wacky combinations. So you'd get mermaids and unicorns and cyclops human beings with no nails. So, and a lot weirder stuff than that as well. Basically, if the Epicurean hypothesis was how life was formed, you'd get all sorts of crazy creatures cropping up left and right. But that's not what we see. Instead, we see kind of orderly classifications of plants and animals. So Paley says, again, the best explanation is not this Epicurean hypothesis, but instead that a designer designed nature. But does this prove that God, defined as omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and a singular monotheistic being, is the designer? Well, Paley doesn't argue this specifically, but he does say that of the designs, nature's designs are greater and more than anything designed by man, and in a degree which exceeds all computation. So, at the very least, there exists a designer whose intelligence and power is far beyond that of any human, and so you'd probably call that God, wouldn't you? So the big objection to the watchmaker analogy and teleological arguments in general, Darwin's theory of evolution. So evolution is a huge spanner in the works for teleological arguments, because to target it at Paley's teleological argument, it shows how you can have multiple parts arranged for a purpose, what Paley said is the key property of design, without a designer. Or to direct it at Hume's teleological argument, it shows how the fitting of means to ends can occur without a designer. And what was it Aquinas said? How things which lack intelligence act towards an end or whatever. Again, evolution shows how things can act for an end without intelligence and without a designer. So evolution by natural selection. That phrase, natural selection, kind of captures the problem for teleological arguments, because it shows how nature itself can, in some sense, select for traits that are advantageous, and so create the appearance of design without a designer. I don't think I've got the book here, but Richard Dawkins, the king atheist himself, wrote a book called The Blind Watchmaker, and this kind of captures well, it's a kind of a dig at Paley, isn't it? Because he's saying how there is no... nature is this kind of blind, unconscious force that has no intention, but nevertheless sort of designs things. So to use this example for the 100th time, the eye. So I don't want to turn this into a biology lesson, but here's a kind of simplified story of how this complex and orderly arrangement of matter, the eye, could emerge organically as a result of evolution. So, 1 billion years or so ago, when everything lived in the sea, some creature that was already alive and reproducing reproduced itself, as creatures do. but this lucky new creature had a random genetic mutation for a protein that reacted to light. And even this crude ability to detect differences in light and dark would be a massive advantage at that time if everything else was blind, because, I don't know, lighter areas might be where the food is, say. So this creature survived and replicated itself, passing on its genes for light-sensitive proteins. And these new creatures are thriving in the light areas with all the food, while the ones without the light-sensitive proteins are languishing in the dark and dying off because there's no food there. So fast forward 1 million years and 1 billion random mutations later, and we've now got multicellular organisms, like a fish, that might have a dedicated cell for detecting light. And this is again a huge advantage because the fish with the light detecting cell could detect when a predator is swimming overhead and escape to survive and pass on its genes. Whereas the fish that doesn't have the genes for this light detecting cell wouldn't be able to detect the predator, and so it would get eaten, and so it wouldn't pass on its genes. But obviously 2 light sensing cells would make you even more likely to survive than just having 1, and 4 would be better still. So these light sensing abilities get progressively selected for and exaggerated over time until eventually you've got a fish that has a kind of entire patch, let's say, of these light sensing cells. Give it another 1 million years of random mutations and maybe the shape of one of the fish's light sensing cell patches would become concave shaped, because this concave shape would enable the fish to detect the direction of where the light is coming from, and so react much earlier to predators. Hopefully you can see where I'm going with this. The concave becomes a cup, that cup might become a basic lens, and over time this lens becomes more sophisticated and precise until you've got a fully working eye that can detect different shapes, different colours, and their direction and distance. The point with this story is that there's no intention behind this process. There's no design. There's no telos or purpose or final cause, just a series of lucky accidents where success means survival rather than progress towards some deliberate goal or end. So Darwin would reject Paley's claim that having multiple parts arranged for a purpose must mean design. The adapting of means to ends, as Hume would put it, such as the various parts of the eye to enable vision, can be explained not as a result of some deliberate intention or design. It's instead just the result of random genetic mutations, survival, and millions of years of time. So the point is that no designer is needed to explain the order in nature, and so God isn't needed. A bit dark. So all the teleological arguments we've looked at so far have pointed to examples of order within nature. Things like the eye and the heart and the wings of a bird, where the different parts are organised for a purpose, or where there's a fitting of means to ends. But of course, Darwin pulls the rug out from under these arguments because evolution shows how this order, this fitting of means to ends or whatever, can emerge organically and naturally without a designer. But Richard Swinburne's teleological argument is different. So rather than focusing in on examples of order within nature, what he calls regularities of co-presence or spatial order, Swinburne's teleological argument instead focuses on examples of order within the laws of nature, what he calls regularities of succession or temporal order. For example, the law of gravity. So gravity acts in a stable and predictable way, keeping the planets in orbits and keeping us stuck to those planets. It's not like gravity one day attracts objects and the next day repels them, or this strength is constantly changing. Or the strong nuclear force which holds the nucleus of an atom together. It's not like this force is constantly fluctuating and one day it gets really weak and all the atoms just fly apart and everything in the universe disintegrates. So the laws of nature, such as gravity and the strong nuclear force and electromagnetism, they are consistent and stable and orderly. By the way, I think this might actually be contentious in physics. I think might be evidence that like the gravitational constant changes. It isn't stable at all, but whatever, this is philosophy, not physics, so let's just give Swinburne the benefit of the doubt. I should also point out that Swinburne doesn't talk about the specific values of gravity and the nuclear forces and these laws of nature. So this is kind of a separate argument called the fine-tuning argument, but it's kind of relevant because the fine-tuning argument, the point of the fine-tuning argument is that if gravity was just slightly weaker or stronger, then planets and life wouldn't be able to form, or the balance between these various forces is such that if you change this balance even slightly, then life couldn't exist. So this fine-tuning argument could be kind of used in conjunction with this Swinburne's teleological argument. So not only is there order and consistency in these laws, but the actual values themselves are perhaps further evidence of design.
It is easy to see that only a very restricted range of laws of nature are consistent with galaxies and stars, planets, life, and intelligence. If the laws of nature are randomly reshuffled at the cusps, then it is only the most extraordinary coincidence that the cosmic slot machine has this time come up with a universe consistent with us.
So why is this? How do we explain this temporal order? Well, Swinburne says we can't give a scientific explanation of why the laws of nature are consistent because scientific explanations kind of have to assume these laws. Like how science works is by assuming there's these consistent laws of nature like gravity, electromagnetism and so on. And then it uses these laws to explain how stuff works. But you can't give a scientific explanation of the laws themselves because, again, science has to assume these laws. It has to assume these consistencies and these regularities of succession in order to make its explanations. So, for example, scientists worked out the gravitational constant from observations. And then once you know what this gravitational constant is, then you can use that value to explain and predict the orbits of the planets. But to do this, you have to just kind of assume these laws, then use them to explain stuff in the world. That's how science works. So again, science kind of assumes temporal order. It assumes these regularities and these consistent patterns, and then it uses these patterns to explain things. But science can't explain the patterns themselves, if that makes sense. So again, we need an explanation of this temporal order. We need an explanation of why the laws of nature behave in these consistent and reliable patterns. Well, again, the scientific explanation isn't going to work for the reasons mentioned, but Swinburne says there is still another type of explanation we have available, which is a personal explanation. So what is a personal explanation? Well, you could explain the order. If you were to ask how the words in this book came to be arranged in the order that they were, the most obvious explanation is that Darwin arranged those words in that order. In other words, the book exists because Darwin wrote it. So rather than providing an explanation of the book in terms of scientific, physics, chemical processes, these impersonal laws, we just instead explain the existence of the book as a result of the agency of the author, in this case Darwin. So we give personal explanations for things all the time. For example, the painting exists because the artist painted it. The garden is tidy because the gardener tidied it up. The building exists because the builders built it. So notice that these explanations, rather than appealing to impersonal laws, instead explain things in terms of the agency of a mind, whether it be the painter, the gardener, or the builder, or whatever. So we've got these two types of explanations, scientific and personal. And we need an explanation of the regularities of succession or temporal order or the consistency of the laws of nature. And as mentioned, the scientific explanation is ruled out. So we only have the personal explanation remaining. So bringing this all together, we could summarise Swinburne's argument like this. There is temporal order in the universe, regular laws or patterns in nature, like gravity, electromagnetism, and the speed of light. And this temporal order needs an explanation. There's two kinds of explanations available, scientific and personal. But the scientific explanation isn't available to explain temporal order because scientific explanations, by their very nature, have to assume temporal order. So the remaining explanation is a personal one. The temporal order of the universe exists because a mind designed it to be that way, and this mind is God. So Swinburne says his argument here isn't intended to be a definitive proof of God. It's not a deductive argument where, if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. Instead, it's an abductive argument, i.e. an appeal to the best explanation. So, in the same way that if you see words on a bit of paper that are arranged in a consistent and orderly way, it's reasonable to assume that the best explanation of this order is that a writer arranged them in that way. Swinburne says the best explanation of the consistency and order in the laws of the universe is also best explained by an author or an intelligence or an agency, i.e. God. Swinburne also addresses Hume's various objections from earlier. For example, that there might be multiple designers rather than a single monotheistic God. So, in response to this, Swinburne applies Occam's razor and says, always suppose only one murderer, unless the evidence forces you to suppose a second. Plus, he says, if there were multiple designers, you'd expect to see evidence of these different designers' style throughout the universe. A bit like how within a city, you get different styles of building depending on the different builders and architects. So Swinburne says, if there were these multiple designers, you'd see an inverse square law of gravitation obeyed in one part of the universe, and in another part, a law which was just short of being an inverse square law. As to whether this lone designer is specifically an omnipotent and omnibenevolent God, Swinburne admits that the temporal order isn't sufficient proof of a designer with these specific attributes. So he admits that this temporal order, this consistency in the laws of nature, is consistent with a being of finite power or moral imperfection. But Swinburne says this doesn't affect the design argument, which, as Cleanthes admits, does not purport to show that the designer of the universe does have these characteristics. So the upshot of Swinburne's argument is that it's reasonable, although not certain, to suppose that a designer is responsible for the temporal order in the laws of the universe. And just how reasonable this belief is depends on how strong the analogy is between the kind of order we usually explain by appealing to a mind, like watches, computers, books and so on, and the kind of deep mathematical order we find in the universe itself. So in summary, teleological arguments, aka design arguments, are arguments which point to examples of order and purpose within nature as evidence of design. And of course, if there's design, there must be a designer, i.e. God, and so God exists. So Most of the teleological arguments we looked at used examples of order within nature, what Swinburne called spatial order. So things like the many parts of the eye for the purpose of vision, or the parts of the heart to pump blood. So for example, Aquinas argued that such order can only be explained by an intelligence. In the same way that an arrow has to be directed by an archer to reach its target, nature needs an agent to direct, for example, a plant to grow towards the sun or a heart to pump blood. And because these things aren't capable of directing themselves towards these goals, Aquinas concludes that it must be God directing them. And then Hume's teleological argument, as presented by the character Cleanthes, draws an analogy between nature and man-made objects. There's a fitting of means to ends that's common to both man-made designs and nature. And we know that man-made objects, like a house, have a designer. So when we continue this analogy between man-made objects and nature, we conclude that nature also has a designer, God. But Hume also raised several objections to teleological arguments, many of which Paley responds to in his watchmaker argument. Paley says it just wouldn't be reasonable to believe that all the various cogs and springs of a watch just happen to come together by chance, and so the watch's existence can only be explained by a designer. This is because the watch has several parts framed and put together for a purpose, which for Paley is the key feature of design. And says Paley, aspects of nature have this property, like how the several parts of the eye are organised for the purpose of vision. For Paley, this organisation for a purpose is equally in need of a designer to explain it as the watch is. Now, these teleological arguments all came before Darwin's theory of evolution in 1859, which is perhaps the strongest objection to them. Evolution offers a powerful explanation of how all these examples, hearts, plants, eyes and so on, could emerge in nature without a designer. So random mutations that help an organism survive or reproduce get passed on and exaggerated, and over millions of years, this process creates features that are so well adapted to their environment that they appear to be designed. So this is a major problem for arguments like Paley's and Hume's, because it shows how the appearance of design can emerge from blind natural processes without a designer. But we next looked at Swinburne's teleological argument, which avoids this issue. Rather than focusing on order within nature, like eyes or hearts, Swinburne focuses on the laws of nature. So while evolution may explain the order within living things, it doesn't explain the deeper order behind the laws that make life possible in the first place. Swinburne points out that the universe behaves in a consistent and orderly way. Gravity always attracts with the same strength. The speed of light is constant, and these laws and rules don't just randomly switch or break down. And this kind of regularity, what Swinburne calls temporal order, is something science assumes but can't explain. So Swinburne argues that the best explanation of this temporal order is a personal one, that a rational mind, i.e. God, created and sustains these laws of nature. But some of the issues Hume raised for teleological arguments may still work against Swinburne's version. Hume pointed out several weaknesses in the analogy between order in nature and order in man-made designs, and these differences exist in Swinburne's version too. For example, there's a big difference between the scale and order of the laws of the universe compared to the scale and order we see in man-made designs. And so it's maybe still a bit of a leap to conclude that because man-made objects like watches have designers, that the laws of the universe must also have a designer. What's more, even if there is a designer, this doesn't necessarily prove that God, defined as an omnipotent, omnibenevolent, monotheistic single being, is that designer. So that was teleological arguments, arguments which reason from order rather than disorder in nature to a creator or designer of this order. But for me, the interesting question is not why is there order rather than disorder in the universe, but instead, why is there a universe in the first place? Why is there something rather than nothing? And that is going to be the topic of the next video, where we move on to cosmological arguments. So that's about it for teleological arguments. I hope you enjoyed it. So all that remains is the books and sources and further reading. So as always, you can get my book. It doesn't include Aquinas's fifth way, Aquinas's teleological argument, but it does include a few more objections and responses to teleological arguments. So you can get that. I'll link also the page on my website, as always, that talks about teleological arguments. And then as for primary sources, I mentioned Aquinas's Summa Theologica, the classic, and that's where Aquinas's fifth way, his teleological argument, comes from. Now, it's called the fifth way because it's the fifth way, as you might expect, the fifth proof of God that Aquinas provides. And we're going to be covering ways 1, 2 and 3 in the next video because they are examples of cosmological arguments. So you can get Summa Theologica. Then David Hume's Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. I mentioned it last episode in Ontological Arguments, and I'm going to be referencing it again in the Problem of Evil. So if you're into your philosophy of religion, then Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion by Hume gets a thumbs up. Then I also mentioned Paley's Natural Theology. I really like the front cover of this one, the skeleton praying. Very, very cool. So, yeah, that's where the watchmaker, watchmaker teleological argument comes from. So you can get that. Oh yeah, Swinburne's paper, The Argument from Design, or whatever it's called. That's from a philosophy journal. I think it's in the public domain by now. I found it somewhere online, so I'll link that down below. Along with, probably the Stanford page and any other useful resources to do with teleological arguments I can find. But that about does it for this video. So thank you again for watching, and I will see you in the next one.